I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, as our audience joins us for our Tackling Victoria's Housing Crisis live panel webinar from VLGA Connect. This is the third in the series on housing key workers in Victorian towns and cities. On behalf of the VLGA, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'm personally coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation this afternoon. I'd like to begin by telling you firstly a little bit about the VLGA. The VLGA supports councils and councillors to deliver great outcomes for local communities through high performance and good governance. It's member-run and non-partisan. The VLGA provides practical advice, direct support, training, professional development, events, networks and resources to members, and carries out research, policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of local councils. The VLGA is the leading voice for local councils and offers members the opportunity to realise their true leadership potential and increase their impact, with a mission of inspiring and enabling good governance in councils. Throughout the course of today's session, please feel free to add any questions or comments that you might have for our presenters in the Q&A box, which you'll find along the bottom of your Zoom menu. You can also use the chat function if you'd like to provide any commentary or discussion amongst the other participants to today's session. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all of those who have registered in the next week or so. We've got about 40 people expected to join us today, but some of those will have registered for the purpose of watching this back at a later stage. Let's get started on our discussion today. We're going to examine the city, peri-urban and regional dimension of key worker housing stress with our panel. In many parts of Victoria, workers are unable to find affordable housing near their employment. And to help us with the discussion about how workers in service industries, seasonal workers are affected, what can be done to ensure access to affordable housing for key workers, and what are the barriers to housing provision, we have Dr. Michael Fotheringham, the Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Dr. Michael Fotheringham has held leadership roles at the Institute since 2014. As the Managing Director, he is responsible for setting the National Housing Research Agenda and curating an internationally lauded policy research evidence base on housing, homelessness and urban issues. He's a member of the National Council of National Shelter and currently serves on a variety of expert advisory panels and is a former non-executive director of Homelessness Australia. Dr. Michael Fotheringham, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Chris. Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us. More from Michael in a moment. We also today have Dr. Marcus Spiller, who's a founding partner at SGS Economics and Planning and is formally qualified in Commerce and Urban Planning. He's practiced as a consultant for much of his career, though he's also worked as an academic, a local government town planner, a ministerial advisor, and a senior bureaucrat in state and Commonwealth government agencies. He's an expert in regional economic development, housing policy, infrastructure funding, and metropolitan governance. Marcus, hello to you. Great to have you here. You're still on mute there, but that's fine. We got the sentiment.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Marcus, and no stranger to our panel discussions. Great to have you back with us. Brett Davis is the CEO of Moyne Shire Council. He's been with the council since 2020 and was appointed CEO in June of 2022. He's a qualified town planner with over 25 years' experience in project management, urban and regional planning, property development management, and facilitation. He's held a number of senior planning and leadership roles in the public and private sectors and has extensive experience in local government and industry, along with having worked around Australia on numerous large-scale projects. Brett, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least is Bess Nolan-Cook, the CEO of Tourism Northeast, the regional tourism board for Victoria's High Country. Bess has a background in marketing, communications and major events, and prior to joining TNE, she was the Director of Marketing and Communications at doTERRA, Australia and New Zealand. Bess holds a Bachelor of Dramatic Art in Technical Production from NIDA, is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and is very passionate about driving meaningful outcomes for the visitor economy. Bess, hello and welcome. Nice to have you all here. As I said to our audience, please use the Q&A box if you'd like to pepper in some questions for our panel, as we have what I'm expecting to be a fairly wide-ranging discussion on this issue of how to house key workers. And perhaps, Michael, could I start with you with maybe an obvious question? When we say key workers, what are we really talking about there? How do we define it?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because there's no singular answer to this. There's no, universally constant definition of key workers. It is very much a local definition, and really it's a place-based definition. So, what is a key worker in the middle of Melbourne, in the centre of Melbourne, or in the outer suburbs of Melbourne is different to in a regional town, and the types of town and size of town, changes that as well. But a lot of national and state-based policies in other countries have defined key sets of occupations, and they're fairly traditional things: nurses, teachers, police and emergency services type roles. In the US, the military gets a Guernsey as well. The nature of the role of the military in the US is always a little bit different. But really, it's the types of roles that, one, you can't work from home to do. You need to actually front up to the workplace. And two, are the things that make those places function, the essential things that make them function. So it is different wherever you go.
So I might just jump straight into a couple of the other panelists for their thoughts on what the key worker in your mind is when you think about key workers. Bess, what's the key worker in the high country, for example?
Well, I think, to pick up on one of Michael's points, a key worker is certainly someone who holds a role that's vital to the operation of a business, and certainly must be done in a location. So making sure that we've got that elasticity within the definition, that means, a parking attendant in an alpine resort is a critical position in order to facilitate operations, as is a barista in a coffee shop. So I think we collectively do need to subscribe to a definition, but it does need to have that elasticity in order to suit a fit for purpose, depending on which location you're based.
Brett, that would resonate with you, I would think, in a tourism-based area like yours.
Oh, absolutely. I like Michael's view around, it's very much place-based, and we've experienced the whole gamut of what we would class as key workers, from an arborist who needs to come in preparation for fire season, who couldn't normally do it unless they have accommodation, through to, baristas and hospo staff over a town that increases by size at Port Fairy by 4 times the amount over summer, that businesses cannot operate without them. Or a corporate accountant for a major dairy plant sort of operator who can't find immediate accommodation. So it becomes a little bit of a stopgap until other accommodation opens up. So right across the board, and particularly in the tourism space, we've found, but there's keys everywhere. We've also early years teachers, nurses, physiotherapists. We've had them all in a very short time that we've been trialing sort of our measures, and it's been most successful, and says that the need for this panel and other things is that there's an absolute dire shortage of appropriate housing to get workers in.
I think that's been really useful to try and define who we're trying to help here. And I wonder, Marcus, before we get into some of the policy discussion, is there an economic definition of a key worker?
No, there isn't an economic, or, to my knowledge, even a planning definition of a key worker. It's one of those things that is difficult to define precisely, either for research purposes or for, statutory planning purposes, but you sort of know it when you see it, kind of thing. You know the issue when you see it. So yeah, we don't have a nice black and white definition.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I jump in with just a couple more thoughts on that before you move on?
Yeah.
One thing I didn't mention that I think we should acknowledge is we're typically talking about low to medium income. We're not talking about people at the top end of the spectrum. So while we talk about police, we're probably not talking about the police commissioner as a key worker in a particular location. And the other one is particularly for regional areas. You know, some of the things we've talked about are year round. Teachers and nurses are key workers year round. There are also seasonal roles that are very much key, particularly in the regional areas. Hospitality, fruit picking, all sorts of things that are fundamental at one part of the year, but not throughout the year. And for housing solutions, that's a particular challenge.
That's an interesting one, Michael. After you, Beth, I think I know what you're going to say.
Oh, I was going to ask, why wouldn't we be capturing the people at the top of the market as well? Because sometimes in respect to housing and that inherent link between housing and employment, often it's about supply, not necessarily cost as well. So a doctor is going to shift the dial considerably in a more regional environment than maybe in a metropolitan environment because they're the only one. And they just happen to be more at that kind of top end of the income bracket than an alternative occupation. Sorry, Marcus, was that the path you were going down?
Yeah, you said it. I have heard anecdotal evidence of major corporations not being able to attract and hold the CEO that they've recruited because there's just no housing available. Now, that is a key worker. But I do agree with Michael that generally speaking, when we're talking about policy responses, we're talking about initiatives to target those medium, middle and lower income workers.
Because they're the ones least able to address the challenge themselves. I mean, there's an availability challenge for the more affluent ones. That's a real challenge too. But the affordability challenge for lower incomes is an even more profound challenge. So, I guess I'm referring to the policy responses rather than the overall problems. I recognise they're both there. You know, we have seen some state governments start to build government housing so that they can staff in the regions, particularly in the more remote regions. So, yeah, it's a complex issue.
Chris,
Fabulous.
could I just
yes,
sorry,
please,
just to add to that analogy around sort of the level, it hit home for me early days starting at Moyne when I was doing my morning dog walk through one of our caravan parks, and this swag tent started rustling, and then out popped my economic development coordinator. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I can't get housing." So like he'd come from interstate and he was sleeping in a swag. So I guess he was getting firsthand experience of the caravan parks that we were managing, but it hit me straight away that this is beyond just a level. I think as both Bess and Marcus and Michael's point to, it's at every level. And we've not been able to recruit at a higher level because you try and get someone out from Melbourne and the housing's not there, or it's at Melbourne money, but we as a council in the regions can't pay Melbourne money to match that expectation. So it's certainly just throw that into the mix. It is across every level, which makes it more unique perhaps than other times we've just spoken of housing shortages.
This is terrific. It's a self-driving panel discussion. I don't have to do very much, but Hannah in our audience, while we're on this particular part of the discussion, is interested in the panel's thoughts on what's the duration that typically you're finding a key worker needs accommodation for.
I'll kick off. We've been running several schemes now for about 18 months or so, and we find the churn is generally around 9 to 12 months. There are some short-term issues like seasonal workers that have come in and out, but what they tend to do by us providing a form of housing that's not necessarily permanent is that they embed in the community. They start working with people and they say, Marcus gets to know them, and then a couple of months later, Marcus says, actually, so-and-so down the road, they're going to have a place coming up, and you get this hidden market open up. And then they move out, and we've got waiting lists on all our worker housing, 3 times oversubscribed. So I would say 9 to 12 months on average would be the duration, Hannah, for the first entry, but they are then staying in the communities more importantly.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very useful. So let's try and get back on the script for this and talk a bit about the policy stuff. Maybe firstly, Michael, what are the policy measures that are, I guess, you would see as barriers, and what are the more effective ones that we need to see more of?
Oh, look, I mean, it's not so much a policy barrier as really we have an overall issue with housing costs relative to wages. And, you know, over the last 2 or 3 decades across the nation, house sale prices and rent prices have gone up much more rapidly than wages, making housing, you know, less affordable overall. Coupled with that, we now have real challenges about the amount of available stock, supply side issues. So, you know, we across the nation, you're hearing governments talking about the need to build more housing more rapidly. That plays out both in the big cities and in the regions. Workforce tends to concentrate in the big cities, so, you know, the pace of build and rebuild is even more challenging regionally. Add to that the impact of natural disasters, you know, fires and floods that have reduced available housing stock, and means that available workforces and material supplies are dedicated to rebuilding rather than building additional supply. You've got a whole storm of trouble.
So talk to us about policy measures that you're seeing as being the most effective to address key worker housing stress.
Yeah, I mean, in Australia, we haven't had a lot of targeted key worker responses at a state or federal level. That hasn't really been a strong characteristic. It's becoming part of the rhetoric, and certainly, you know, through the COVID period, we started hearing about essential workers a whole lot more than we ever used to. And, you know, it's largely the same group of people. But you know, in other countries, we've seen a range of programs, equity loans for targeted occupations. Typically, there'll be a legislated list of the sorts of occupations I mentioned earlier, your teachers and nurses and police and so on, or shared equity programs that are specifically targeted to key workers. Sometimes we've seen head leasing arrangements, which is effectively where a government, whether it's a local government or a state, rents a property from somebody on behalf of a key worker and then sublets to them in effect, and you know, pays part of the rent or offsets the rent somehow. So, you know, there's a range of different ways you can do that. The US, we've seen sort of the equivalent of first homeowner grants targeted to those occupations, but very localized approaches to it. So it's an area where there's a lot more to be done.
So you've used a couple of international examples there. Is there a particular country that is regarded as a leader in this space?
In key workers specifically, not really. I mean, look, in terms of housing affordability, there's a range of ways you can you know, run a league table on that. We're not at the top. You know, we've got a real challenge there. You know, the supply of social and affordable housing overall is a key measure in this as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, Australia sits at or below 4% of housing stock across the country is social housing. So that's community, not-for-profit community housing and public housing. A lot of countries that we normally look at as similar to us have substantially higher rates than England. It's more around the 20%. The Netherlands, it's around 50%. You know, there's quite a variety of scores. There are plenty of other countries down near our end as well. So Canada's much the same as us.
Right.
But, you know, that overall supply of lower cost housing, particularly targeting lower incomes, not just in the big cities, not just in Towers in Collingwood, but actually across the state. Supply mixed in amongst market housing is a key ingredient.
So you said the policy measures aren't necessarily barriers, but Marcus, I suspect there are economic barriers here. Would you like to talk a bit about those?
Yeah, look, the economic barriers do merge into policy issues, of course. They're never too far apart. When I think of key worker housing or essential worker housing, I think of it more through the lens of rental tenure rather than ownership. You know, having the availability of rental housing for your baristas all the way through to your doctors. And the phase that we're in Australia is that the rental sector is really, we could almost consider it a cottage industry. You know, it's dominated by the so-called mum and dad investors who typically only have one dwelling. They're typically not strategic investors. A lot of them are what some people call accidental investors, inheritors of a dwelling or something like that. So they're not actually motivated to invest and expand the sector. A lot of them make pretty ordinary returns as well, actually, which some recent research has demonstrated, as well as offering a pretty poor outcomes for tenants. So the rental sector in our country is highly underdeveloped compared to other nations. because we've always thought that rental housing is just a stepping stone, transitional housing to home ownership. So we need to ask ourselves the question, and we are asking ourselves the question, what do we need to grow the rental sector so that it can supply key worker and essential worker housing and rental housing generally? And there's some pretty massive barriers in the way, Chris, of an economic nature. One is that the returns that a corporate investor or a major investor would make out of building, owning and operating rental housing are just not adequate. They don't provide an adequate yield. Unlike your mum and dad investors, a corporate investor is unlikely to rely on future capital gains to make the investment, and they don't have some of the allied benefits attaching to things like negative gearing. So whereas a mum and dad investor might be happy to hang on to a dwelling in a desultory fashion, corporate investors really typically, I'm not saying that there is a build to rent sector beginning to emerge, but it's very much an emergent sector. And to compound the problem in regional areas, you have construction costs, which typically are significantly higher. And we don't have a tradition of developers building to hold stock. So, but essentially there is a range of barriers, which maybe we'll get onto later, but the key one is that the returns aren't there for investors.
I wonder whether Bess or Brett have anything to add to that in terms of seeing that playing out in your part of the world.
I would certainly say that the costs associated with the foundational infrastructure are a huge barrier. You know, water, internet, roads, and Brett, you would know this better than me, needing to balance all of these different things. But certainly there are a number of constraints that certainly have some fairly hefty price tags.
Yeah, absolutely. Enabling infrastructure is a key one in the further out of Melbourne you get. And there's, I think that it's a market failure in the regions. The reason why we started getting heavily involved, 4 years ago in this space was that we identified exactly what Marcus outlined. Builders want to get in and get out and get their return and move on, as do investors. They don't particularly care about a nuanced approach in smaller rural and regional areas to get those, let's do some build to rent and maybe get some workers in. More than that, it's all market driven. The margins are thin to begin with. There's two other elephants in the room we haven't touched on: windfall gains tax and the impact that is having as this wet blanket over any rural and regional investment right now, because it's scaring off investors. And the second one is Airbnb, and the fact that I've got towns that 70% of the year houses are empty. So we've got houses, but they are yielding different returns for those investors, and that is their right. But it is quite a frustration when you see available housing underutilised.
I was going to ask Marcus that very question next around the short-term rental market. We've done a whole webinar on this last time around. Is that a fair observation, Marcus, across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in high amenity tourism towns, it's definitely the case. And I know we did some work with Bess and looked at Bright, where a fifth of the housing stock, 1/5 of the housing stock is actually on the Airbnb platform or related platforms or similar platforms. And the owners of those dwellings can, based on our broad calculations, even though they're occupied for only a proportion of the year, can make twice as much income as they would renting them out on the regular permanent market. So yeah.
But we also need them.
You also need them too, yes.
We are a very tourism-heavy region in Northeast Victoria, and we need Airbnb. It fills a gap in the market. Yep. Without the volume of visitors and the complete absence of, large at-scale commercial accommodation, it really does serve a purpose. And my personal view is I think that we need to start looking at alternative ways to provide housing for key workers that's dedicated housing for key workers. Because, you know, Brett, you touched on the fact that it is someone's right. If they're the investor of that particular property, they can choose to rent that out when they're not using it. So it's a very tricky and complex problem.
I mean, in the past, and this connects to what Michael was saying earlier, we understood that the private market is unlikely to come forward with the essential worker housing for the reasons we're talking about, you know, inadequate returns, high costs, difficulty of getting infrastructure, etc. And we did have investment in social and affordable housing. These days, we think of social and affordable housing as a residualised safe, you know, welfare net. But way back in the day was actually investment to support local economic development. I mean, we built whole estates in the Latrobe Valley, for example, to enable the power industry to go ahead. If you think back on it, you know, the education department used to build housing for teachers. If the local base hospital had its, you know, little village of dwellings for the nurses and doctors and so on and so forth. So the fact is that whilst the returns to the individual investor are not sufficient to motivate private capital, there is a gain to the wider community. And I'm not talking an airy-fairy gain, I'm talking about an economic gain. You actually produce more income in the region by providing this housing. So what we need to do is to find a way of topping up the returns to the private investor by dipping into taking some of the wider uplift in income that's enjoyed in the region and sharing a bit of that with the investor so that they are motivated to supply the housing comes and everybody wins. So, yeah.
So find a way, you say, Marcus. How realistic is that? Can we take our lead from anywhere else that might be trying something in that space?
Well, Bess is trying something in that space. Maybe, Bess, you want to outline your idea?
Well, probably not to go into too much detail, but certainly, you know, we've done a lot of work in this space and really, as I mentioned before, recognising the fact that platforms like Airbnb serve a purpose within the community. However, you know, at the end of the day, we still need homes for workers, and that inherent link between employment and access to appropriate housing. I won't use the word affordable, but appropriate housing is so critically important. And again, our view would be that we need to actually start to be a little bit creative and brave in terms of trying new things. You know, how might we unlock the use of already privately owned land and leverage new technology through modular dwellings, for example, you know, and how then might we tie that to somebody's employment as kind of one example. You know, certainly talking to different developers, there is definitely a time limit within the commercial development space in terms of how long someone's willing to hold stock for key workers. So I would suggest that we need to challenge ourselves to be brave, and just because the solution doesn't necessarily exist currently, it shouldn't stop us from really trying new things and experimenting to really try and, as I said, unlock that kind of privately owned land that already exists at the moment. I don't know, Marcus, whether you have anything to go on from that.
Yeah, so one of the ideas that Bess and her people have been testing is the idea of enlisting the cooperation of local businesses to invest in a co-owned business, which would itself commission the production of rental housing from the private sector. So this co-owned business owned by local businesses or independently owned would create the housing, and those local businesses, and they could be hospitals, they could be anybody that needs key workers, would be paying the equivalent of a membership fee or something like that, which provides a pot of money to top up those returns to the private supplier of the housing. So you're bridging that return gap. There are probably a million and one different ways of mixing the cocktail, but basically you need to top up returns. And if you've got local businesses that need key workers who know that their bottom line is going to improve if they get their workers, they, given the chance, will potentially pay to get access to those workers, and in so doing provide a top up to those housing investors. So as I said before, everybody's a winner. But somebody has to be, as Beth says, somebody has to be brave. Somebody has to make the first move. Government has to support this innovation, because unless somebody catalyses such a vehicle, it won't happen.
So on that, Michael, what's the likelihood of the policy framework being able to support something like that to happen?
Oh, look, I think, we're at a stage at the moment where federal and state governments are truly engaged in housing in a way we haven't seen in many decades, and possibly ever in this country. And so, I think there's every possibility of every measure getting a fair run at the moment. There's a genuine curiosity about what are the things we could be doing. And the federal government are leading a consultation right now around a national housing and homelessness plan. We've never actually had a housing and homelessness plan in this country, which is kind of extraordinary on its own. We've had a couple of attempts at a housing strategy. We've had a homelessness one, but never one that covers both. But the whole point of that is not a federal set of programs, but actually federal programs, state programs, local government programs, and the roles of not-for-profit and commercial sectors all on the same page, and getting people rowing in the same direction, I think. And that's proven to be quite effective in several other countries, places like Canada and elsewhere that are similar to us in many ways, with federated systems of government that make things confusing or dilute responsibility. But I'm actually very optimistic that we're at a point where issues like this are getting more attention than they have historically, and actually starting to get the attention they deserve.
Okay, mindful we've passed the halfway mark already. We do want to come to Q&A with the audience, and there's a couple of questions already sitting there. So please pop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll dedicate some time to those in just a little while. Brett, from a rural council perspective, I wonder if it might be worth you just talking for a couple of minutes about the things that you've tried and the lessons or the observations that you've taken away from those initiatives.
It's slightly related to where I think where Bess is going, which is really good. We've first of all, we identified quick sticks. We're lucky enough to own caravan parks that are really well located in townships. So we with assistance of both federal and state, got cabins built in 2 of those locations. And as I talked to before, we then put expressions of interest out to businesses, and were triple oversubscribed. So it was really a triaging. But those businesses sign up and they do the deal with their employee to go in there. So we're just really the middle person in that. But it says and suggests, as Marcus is alluding to, there is a willingness there for that almost co-investment principle. As a second, in our Port Fairy caravan park, we've got this lodge, a sort of a 1960s built lodge that houses 30 to 40 sort of rooms. And so last year we did a work, stay and play program, and we ended up housing about 20 workers for the town over the peak period, where businesses again would say, I'll need 3 beds, and then they would strike the deal with council, and they were responsible for all and sundry in that regard. This year we've had 100 registrations. We've gone out for the same thing, and from tomorrow until the end of January, that lodge will be full. And it's again a great sign. We're lucky enough to have a facility. The council was brave enough to turn away from the commercial hiring of that lodge out traditionally every year to private entities, to turning it into a different offer, because they realise that the shortage is real, and businesses won't thrive if they've got a shutter. So they're 2 examples where we've done the cabins, and then we've also turned over a facility there's some work for council because it's our land, and there's those sorts of things. But generally, it's a self-fulfilling model in that regard. We're not doing it to make profit. We're doing it at subsidised rates versus what they would be paying, but not to the extent where it's costing. It's a cost-neutral exercise because we see the benefit back into the businesses and what comes out for their service offer. So that's probably, and our visitor servicing teams then service that, putting together packs for them. And last year we had about 4 of them stay on beyond this period, find other employment, take up apprenticeships. That's 4 more than if we'd done nothing. And 4, Marcus can talk about the multiplier effect, but 4 plus into a small setting has massive benefits. And not only Port Fairy, also in Mortlake, we've got those cabins and Koroit, and that's benefited those towns and major industry as well as small business.
Brett, do you see this as a space that the council is going to need to stay in and play in for a long time to come?
To be frank, yes, because we couldn't wait for policy levers, planning changes, or anything else. I think, agreeing with Michael, it's the first time the real conversations are being held at state and federal, and we look forward to what comes out of that. But the immediacy is here and now.
Bess, I'm mindful when we spoke ahead of this panel today, you made the point to me a couple of times about wanting to see the word appropriate replaced in place of affordable. Can you talk about why that's important from your perspective?
I think it's very wrapped up in that definition of key worker and looking at the spectrum from everyone at an entry-level role to a mid-level role to that kind of higher end that we spoke about before, and appropriate housing for an 18-year-old who has just left school, who's living their best life, working in a ski field, is very different to a mature-aged worker who might have a family, who is looking to, make a tree change or a sea change, or, move to a rural or regional area. So again, it comes down to that kind of horses for courses, but it is about appropriateness. And as I alluded to before, sometimes affordability isn't the barrier, it's actually supply. And the cost of doing nothing is significant. So, Brett, I take my hat off to you because I think that's a wonderful initiative and really demonstrates the demand that exists within the market for this type of coordination and provision of service around housing. But yeah, it's very, very tricky. And I also believe that government at all levels needs to be at the table to solve this longer term.
So mindful the questions are building up. We'll get to those in just a second. You've just made an interesting comment that the cost of doing nothing, and I forget how you ended that sentence, but I want to go to Marcus around that very issue. What is Victoria missing out on because it doesn't have adequate key worker housing?
Well, it's missing out enormously. I happen to know, because I've worked with Bess in the past, that in the northeast, the tourism northeast region, the total GDP of that region, the total income that's generated in that region. So just to remind everybody, GDP is wages and salaries plus the profits of businesses. That cake is 2% smaller than it would have otherwise been because of the lack of housing to house skilled workers. Now, that doesn't even allow for the lack of housing for unskilled workers. And 2% of regional GDP there is $160 million per year. So Victoria, this is not transferring from other parts of Victoria. Net, Victoria is missing out just in that region $160 million a year. So why can't we find a way of tapping into that prospective gain to generate the housing? I also know from some other studies, for example, in New Zealand, the Bay of Plenty region, lack of affordable housing was modelled to reduce GDP in that region by as much as 6%. So this is one of the reasons why we need to think of this housing as essential infrastructure, not just accommodation.
So just to reiterate, that 160 million figure was just for one portion of the state.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Have you thought about how that extrapolates out to a Victoria-wide figure?
Well, you could probably prorata it. I haven't done the number, but you can readily imagine that it will ramp up very, very rapidly. We're talking about actual businesses that could do more, could serve more customers, produce more product, but they literally can't because they don't have the workers. So it's really holding back the state's productive capacity potential.
So I want to come back to the regional versus metro thing if we have time shortly and see what differences you might see there. But I do want to start getting some of these questions from the audience dealt with. I want to start with Libby's question, Libby in Surf Coast Shire, because it's been sitting there for a while. Libby says, thanks for the discussion about what a key worker is. She's raising the issue of artists and the creative economy, which is significant in the Surf Coast. And if, as she says, if we lose all our artists because they can't afford to live here, that would be a massive loss to our cultural identity and economy. Have we done any work to put a figure on the creative economy and what it's missing out on from a key worker point of view?
I think that point's well made. I don't know about putting figures on it, but I'm aware that in East Gippsland Shire, their recently, relatively recently adopted economic development strategy identifies the creative sector as an important economic driver, a driver of visitation, a driver of local well-being, and just a driver of the local economy generally. So they haven't separated it out from the economy. You need it in the mix if you're going to have a successful community. And yes, you've got to, in that sense, and in plenty of other senses, I dare say, artists should be regarded as essential workers in those locales, and do need not only the accommodation but the workspaces. And indeed, we find in the inner city of Melbourne that a number of councils, Melbourne, Yarra, and others, probably Marybeck, I think, actually have programs to create workspaces for artists, and some of them are even delving into accommodation, housing strategies. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question there, Libby. Mike at the same council, Surf Coast, is wanting the panel's views on community land trusts or similar. Michael, is this one that you could perhaps tackle?
Absolutely. So community land trusts, for those who aren't familiar, essentially take the land cost out of housing, because land is often the largest cost, but it's effectively sharing the land at a cooperative level, so you can have multiple properties on it. In Australia, it's been very, very little used, mostly only for remote Indigenous solutions rather than anything at all mainstream. Whereas in the US and the UK, it's a much stronger problem. As co-op housing more broadly is also stronger in those places. I think there's a lot of potential for it. I think what we're seeing, and it's been alluded to earlier, the role of off-site construction, modular and prefab housing really opens up the possibility to start to do more in that space. Okay.
Marcus, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I support what Michael said. I mean, I think, the other, it's not an elephant in the room, but the other thing that we need to contend with is that there's probably, as a result of, as demonstrated by the work of Michael's colleagues, we've probably got a structural decline in access to home ownership, and we're going to have to find a whole bunch of different ways of meeting Australia's housing needs. Community land trusts is one of them. There's also co-build and co-housing models. There's shared equity models. And I dare say we possibly need to build new entities that, from a tax point of view, mimic the bank of mum and dad. We're...
Yeah, and just to add to that, I guess, we're seeing...
But also exciting times.
Sorry, Marcus. We're seeing a real openness towards more use of granny flats particularly in, suburban parts of our big cities, but the entry of those onto rental registers across the country is opening up more. The ability to subdivide and so on more so is something that's happening in virtually every state and territory at the moment. If you add to that, we've got a lot of retail properties that have a shop, with what used to be an apartment on top. It's largely used as lazy storage these days. The shop top housing is something that we could actually bring back and do a lot more with. So I think there's opportunities to make more diverse use of pieces of land than singular use that we tend to stick to at the moment.
Do we see the state government's planning reforms, particularly in relation to, as of right, construction of granny flats, being a potential solution in the key worker space?
I'll kick off. I think for small towns it's a good step, but no, it would be my frank. And Michael's touched on a point that could be a whole other VLGA Connect session, and that is
Another panel.
is planning, and the traditional zone-based models do not solve modern housing dilemmas anymore. And the old mercantile models, and you know, I think Marcus spoke about it earlier, where Cadbury would build a factory and they would build the worker housing. Now, clearly there's environmental and other aspects around the type of housing that would need to get built, but we get caught up in the world of buffers and distances, and this goes here and this goes here, and we're losing that ability to be flexible. Or a number of shop top houses across regional Victoria that are empty or have boxes in them because the building code doesn't allow, for fire reasons, you know, access, or stairwells have been cut off because the owner doesn't want to deal with the thing that's upstairs. We need to incentivize and get back to what the existing opportunities are in there as well, and the red tape is quite strangling.
I think the other thing we need to consider is livability.
Yep.
You know, like with all of the research that we've done, certainly interviewing employers and employees and potential tree changes, people don't just want somewhere to live. For anyone who's genuinely interested in, you know, making a change into a new environment, they want to be part of the community and they want to feel like it's a home. And we can't lose sight of that either. So it's not just about building boxes for people to live in. It's about creating homes and adding value to the community in not just an economic sense, but also in a social sense.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Bess, really good point. I think we kind of look quite mirrored around a key worker, but we forget about the spouse and family and how that all works. And certainly the toe in the water that we've put in there predominantly suits the single occupant rather than the family. And that, without that investment in families, these communities aren't going to regenerate. They're getting older in our neck of the woods. So yeah, we need the middle tier to return and invest and be part of the community, but it only gets helped by having more housing availability. And
it's so important for the sports clubs and, you know, to rejuvenate those communities. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Chris, I know you want to move on, but
that's all right.
I do want to say this about the planning thing, that planning seems to be in the crosshairs everywhere. It seems to be the thing that's caused the housing crisis, which I think is, to say the very least, grossly exaggerated. Generally speaking, most proposals to build housing are approved pretty swiftly, and the stats show that. The problems don't really lie in the planning system. They tend to lie more in what Bess was talking about earlier, the fact that we might have zoned land, but doesn't have infrastructure available to it, or it might be in fragmented holdings, or the owner just doesn't want to sell because that's their superannuation and they want their pot of gold at the end of when they want it. So there are. I think we really do need to get some balance to the discussion about the role of planning in as a barrier, because in the end, it's actually a facilitator. It creates the conditions for housing to be built.
All points very well made. Let's see if we can deal with a few more questions. Councillor Emerson at Northern Grampians is talking about when a large business in a small community has a sudden increase in workforce, 50 or 60 workers, how to deal with the urgent temporary housing issue.
There's several options there. This is happening across the renewable energy sector in rural and remote councils. The concept of worker camps is coming up time and again with the modular housing solution, because modular can be stood up within a sort of three-month period. It's very hard to even get a local motel room in a lot of areas now, because a lot of these energy workers are taking up motel space as well, and then that's spinning off. But as to the immediate solution, really it's probably some sort of transport model from a bigger regional city, unfortunately, until such time as that you can get things onto the ground.
Okay, I'm seeing nods from the other panellists there. Thanks for the question, Murray. Jim at Pyrenees, picking up on your lodge example. Brett, Jim's talking about the old pubs in rural towns that have vacant rooms which are not able to be used for accommodation due to compliance issues, some of the stuff that you were talking about before. Yeah. Could there be an incentive for owners to upgrade these for worker accommodation, and what might that incentive look like?
Cash. Like grants, a grant scheme for those sorts of things, I think would be a great. I hadn't thought about old pubs, but that's a really good example. There's a number of pubs that are shuttered in many rural towns across Victoria, and they've all got lodging. So yeah, I think some sort of government grant scheme that assists in that regard, from my perspective, is a great suggestion or a great idea.
I'm reminded, Chris, because I've been around long enough, of the postcode 3000 program in central Melbourne, which sparked the revival of living in the CBD. Now we think it's funny that it even needed a spark, but it was sparked by the City of Melbourne providing advice and assistance and some financial help to the owners of underutilised office space in the central city to convert it to housing. So yeah, cash is essential, but even just encouragement and support and advice around the regulatory maze that needs to be negotiated, around health and safety and fire and so forth, makes a big difference. Yeah.
I want to note, Councillor Haynell had a very similar question. Hopefully that answers your question, Claudia, but please drop something in the Q&A if there was an element of that we didn't get to. Not sure about whether immigration is a linked issue here, whether the panel wants to talk to this. Councillor Greedy is suggesting that this problem will only get worse while we have, in his words, 2,000 migrants per day coming into Australia. Where are they going to live? Is there a correlation between key workers and migrants?
Well, the thing is, we need that migration in order to actually keep our economy pumping along. I did notice during the week, I think it was this week or maybe last week, that a senior economist, Chris Richardson, was sort of saying, well, maybe we need to tap the brakes on incoming students in order to ease the pressure on the housing market. And my reaction was, firstly, we need those students for all sorts of reasons. It's a very important export earner for Victoria. But secondly, the student housing area is a really successful one. I mean, it's one area where the corporate sector has cottoned on to build to rent. So you have lots of dedicated student housing. And if that's one area where we have an effective solution.
So some lessons perhaps could be learned from that, Michael.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Well, yes, absolutely. But just to echo Marcus's point, quite a lot of key workers are migrants, whether they're temporary or permanent. But also, a lot of the people who work on housing construction are migrants. That's actually how we build the workforce. We have a workforce shortage at the moment in that space, and there's really two ways you can build the workforce up. One is trainees and apprenticeships, and that takes time, and the other is to import them. We need to do a bit of both.
One more question from Brent McAllister. Views on the combined impact of increased state compliance and taxes. The changes to rental laws in Victoria have been a major negative to investment, and he's bringing in the windfall gain tax and other things that Brett was talking about before. Economic question there, Marcus. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm a supporter of. I'm a supporter in principle of windfall gains. I do think that development rights are owned by the community, not by the landowner, and we should share that uplift in value. That's another topic for another day. On the question of regulation in the rental sector, as I said earlier, the rental sector is now, growing rapidly. A third of households rent. I think about half of them rent for at least 10 years. Their lives shouldn't be at the behest of their landlord, at the whim of their landlord, to put it bluntly. We do need a regulatory regime that allows them to make their house a home. And I don't think running a threadbare rental sector is the way to improve things. I think we need to build the rental sector, get more capability into it.
Okay, just making sure none of the other panelists want to jump in on that. Brett, I sense.
Yeah, look, I think the windfall gains tax is a blunt instrument that needs tweaking for different settings of development. So where a shire or a city such as Hume grows by what we would grow annually in 2 weeks, I understand the need for a windfall gains tax. That's my only take on that. But I'm with you, Marcus. I agree that it needs to be and reinvested accordingly, because councils out my way aren't ever going to get into that development contribution space because it takes significant time and resource. So we do need to capture it for the community. I think one we haven't touched on is institutional investment and bias. There are banks that will not lend, even in a town such as Port Fairy or Koroit, because it's deemed rural, regional, therefore little. So investors shy away as well, and they steer into the regional cities and the growth corridors. But there is an investment case, and that's perhaps where government can guarantee or change some setting so that there's more institutional investment in smaller settings. We don't have scale, but every job has an impact. So I'll be intrigued on Michael and Marcus's view in that regard, and Bess's, around the frustration of even the banks don't play in the space, and they're often the lever to get investment going.
Well, you're right. The institutions are only very tentatively putting their toes in the water in massive metropolitan markets, and typically really only in Melbourne and Brisbane. So regional markets are really behind the 8 ball. What you say is well thought through. In the UK, there was a definitive government push to underwrite guarantee returns in order to kickstart the build-to-rent sector. And once it took off, then the market ran with it. And even in a place like Koroit and Port Fairy, where you do have long-term secure returns, institutions will pile in once it's demonstrated. It's that first mover market failure issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
It kind of lends itself to that idea of having that coordinating entity, doesn't it? Where all levels of government are sitting at the table, and it comes back to that point about being brave. Who's going to make the first move? What's the concept? How do we unlock the capital? And, let's give it a go, because, Brett, what you've done, you've proven demand. So how do you formalise that to a degree that does unlock capital?
So we're going to have to wrap this up. We've already gone past the hour mark. If you're all okay just to stay for a couple more minutes, I want to ask you a question about, we've got a lot of councillors in the room. As elected representatives, this is a really complex space for councillors to navigate, all the different stakeholders with the different values and context, etc. What advice do you have for councillors on how to navigate this space and represent their communities as effectively as they can? I'll start with you, Brett, as the CEO, because you've probably faced this there in Moyne.
Oh, look, there's certainly councillors, you've got to be a bit brave. Be presented with the facts, but baby steps is a good entrance, and it's that first mover. If you build it, they will come. That is the oldest analogy and the most accurate analogy around this situation. And you can demonstrate to government, look, we've done this, and Pyrenees have done a magnificent job with their housing development, and I think they've just ticked over to go again. So they're an exemplar in that regard, but that was a big risk for that organisation in pre-COVID. So it's about backing yourselves in. if it's not about that now, it's also about putting some policy settings in. So it is a council plan objective. It is an aspiration. So when you're talking back through your community, there is a genuine and communicated need for why you're doing what you're doing. But there's certainly a market appetite.
Any thoughts on that from the other panellists?
Well, just a quasi-philosophical one, and that is that local government can do something that neither state nor Commonwealth government can do, and that is think about how the different policies and levers come together in a place and in a community. So local government thinks about things in a connected up way. So the big role that I think local government can play in this key worker housing area is to demonstrate, and it does, you've got to keep saying it, it's not just once, but a million times, that, if you don't have key workers, you're foregoing productive capacity. Your local communities are foregoing services. You're creating a divided community. So you've got the evidence that creates the narrative that's got us to this point. As Michael says, everybody's talking housing and we're going to see some action, and it's partly because of the narratives coming from local government.
So perhaps a last question for anyone on the panel that wants to take it. If there's one person you could get in the ear of, and there's one thing you'd like to see done as a matter of urgency or priority, who and what would that be? Michael, as the policy man, who's the top of your advocacy list to get to and to say what?
I get into a lot of ears on a very regular basis. So I'm actually pretty happy with my ear-based journeys at the moment. But look, I think, ministers for housing across the country are key players in this, but equally, local governments have, as Marcus has just said, a really fundamental role. And, it needs all three.
And Bess, I sensed you might have wanted to say something there.
I was just thinking the treasurer. I think that we do need to fund some trials of scale that looks at leveraging privately owned land, utilising modular solutions and bringing kind of planning, finance and construction together, and really trialling how we can make it as easy as possible to unlock housing supply in a slightly different way to the traditional path that we're on at the moment. And I think the only way to know whether it's going to be effective is to give it a go.
I think that's a really good final point. So if you're all happy to leave it there, I just would like to thank you all for contributing to a very spirited and easy discussion to lead today. So Michael Fotheringham, Marcus Spiller, Bess Nolan-Cook and Brett Davis, thank you all for your contributions to our panel today. And we've got some applause coming from the audience for you. Thank you to all of our audience attendees. For those who've registered but haven't been able to join us today, they'll get a link to this in due course to watch back. We're just about the end of our panel calendar for 2023, but never fear, there's a big program in the works for 2024, and we're looking forward to telling you about that in the very near future. Thank you all for joining us today on our live panel webinar on Victoria's housing crisis. And goodbye for now from VLGA Connect.